Hello, everybody. I'm Lois Kam-Heyman. Welcome. Let's see. I'm a speech-language pathologist. I've been a speech-language pathologist for 40 years. Yikes. And I'm presently the director of the Shelley and Stephen Einhorn Communication Center at the Center for Hearing and Communication, which many of you may know as the League for the Hard of Hearing. And we have a center down there where we work with deaf and hard of hearing children, and always have for the last 100 years. And then 3 years ago, I opened the Auditory Processing Center as part of what we do down there. So I'll be talking to you about auditory processing disorder and something I'm going to be calling auditory-based language disorder, or auditory-based language processing disorder, because what about if the child passes the APD exam? But I'm going to be talking about that today. And the reason I got interested in this is that my background is working with deaf and hard of hearing children in the auditory oral, auditory verbal method for those 40 years. And 20 years ago, in my private practice, I started getting children referred to me who were hearing, but presented as if they had a hearing loss. And I got very, very interested in these children because I thought, well, nobody's seeing them, nobody's diagnosing them, and what is this? And the things that we do with deaf and hard of hearing children, is there a crossover in the therapeutic interventions with children that are presenting like this? And so I took that on, and I found it very, very challenging and interesting, and then worked with that until I wrote a book about it. I have the book up here. It's called The Sound of Hope, and the reason it was so popular, I think it's good information, but Rosie O'Donnell was my client, and she wrote the introduction, so I ended up getting a lot of press about it. But it did do a lot to bring about the idea of auditory processing disorder, auditory processing skills in children, and that there are many, many children that are suffering with these difficulties, and they're being misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed and definitely not treated. So I'm here today to talk to you about it, the model that the audiologist at my center and I have put together, and the interventions that we do that we have found to be very, very successful. Of course, you won't get the therapy, in an hour and a half, but I'll try to touch on that a little bit. All right, so the problem, this thing keeps coming up, the problem that gets presented is that a parent will come in and say, my child is having difficulty following directions, they're having difficulty in the classroom, they say huh and what a lot, they need directions repeated all the time, and their teacher or neuropsychologist or Aunt Bessie or my next door neighbor or on and on and on has said that my child has an auditory processing disorder. And so I see a lot of head shaking. Auditory processing disorder has become sort of a catch-all term that, like ADD, ADHD once was or still is, and it's sort of like if you don't know what it is, let's call it auditory processing disorder. And that's actually not true. It is a very real disorder. It's a real disorder that ASHA recognizes as a disorder. And what I want to do is sort of talk about what it is and what it isn't, and what could it be when it isn't. Okay? So that's where we're going to go. So how do we really know if the child has an auditory processing disorder? And what is the difference between auditory processing and language processing? And then what is the difference between auditory processing and attentional disorders, ADD, ADHD? Because all of these things get all combined together, and we sort of have a hodgepodge. And then, of course, what do we do about it? At our center, the problem was that, and I think it's a problem in most places, is that auditory processing disorder usually and should be diagnosed by the audiologist. The audiologist is the only person that can give the label of auditory processing disorder to a child or an adult, but I'm only talking about children today. The speech pathologist cannot make that diagnosis with that label. The neuropsychologist, although they believe they cannot make that diagnosis because it is diagnosed through the audiological testing that actually says if the pathways from the ear to the brain are working without delay or disorder. And I'm going to get more into that later. But when we look at that auditory processing disorder, these are the things that the audiologist is looking at. They're looking at localization and lateralization. They're looking at auditory discrimination, auditory pattern recognition, temporal aspects of audition, or the timing aspects, auditory performance decrements with competing stimuli, and acoustic signals. So that translates as what? Listening and noise, right? Auditory figure ground, listening and noise. So for all of us who work with deaf and hard of hearing children, does any of this look familiar? Right? And so we start thinking about hearing loss and auditory processing, that in the end, we cannot test children who have hearing loss for auditory processing disorder. And therefore, we cannot say that a child who has hearing loss has an auditory processing disorder. But can we say that children, and this is the question, who are hearing impaired or have hearing loss have auditory processing issues? Yes, of course they do. But when we're using the term of auditory processing disorder, we are talking about children who have typical normal hearing and then have the delay or distortion in what I'm going to call a higher up area of processing of getting the sound to the brain. So the audiologist is the only one that can make the diagnosis, and we can't give the test to children under the age of 7. All right? So I get lots of reports from audiologists with a child that's 5 years old or 4 years old and sometimes 3 years old, where the audiologist said the child has an auditory processing disorder. And it can't be. And it can't be because the tests that we do to test auditory processing disorder are normed on children 7 and above. And the reason for that is the auditory pathways are developing those first 7 years of life. Actually, they're developing until 12 or 15 years, but the test that we are giving them to diagnose this disorder can be given at age 7 because those processes are already intact in most children. So people that diagnose early, it's like, how many speech pathologists do I have in the room? Oh my goodness, it's the other way around. How many teachers of the deaf? There they are, great. And audiologists? Oh, okay, great. So we can't do the test because it's going to be a false positive situation. For instance, for my speech pathology friends, when my child was 5 years old and in kindergarten, the speech pathologist called me up and said, your child has an R problem, production of the R sound. Well, I said, really? And I started questioning her. And after I questioned her a number of times, she said, are you a speech pathologist? And I said, yes, because you really don't work with an R. It develops until the age of 7. So to work with it at age 5, the child's going to be in therapy 2 years, but they're going to get it at age 7. Same thing with this. If we're diagnosing kids and treating them at age 5, then, okay, they're going to get better, but they're not getting better because of the intervention. They're getting better because of maturation. So we really want to be very careful about that. What else do we have to figure out about auditory processing disorder? If you can't see them till age 7, that's a problem because for intervention, we know that earlier intervention is better. So we do have a screening test that the audiologist can give from the ages of 5 to 7 called the SCAN-C. And that tests only the areas of auditory processing that are developed by age 5. So that's a screening with saying that the child may be high risk for auditory processing. And the speech-language pathologist has tools to diagnose what areas of weakness in auditory issues the child may be having as early as age 4. Okay, our tests and normative data go down to age 4. So there is a way to be looking at these children and looking at the auditory pathways and the auditory interventions that can help that child. But what we found is that usually the audiologist will diagnose the problem if they're sent to the audiologist, and then a list of accommodations and modifications are made, and they're mostly school-based accommodations and remediations, and there's no real intervention. And so what happens to that child? the audiologist is at the end of their limits of diagnosing it and saying where the difficulties are. So we have found that by teaming up audiologists and speech pathologists, I then can test the child in ways that audition impacts language and how those underlying skills of language that are auditory, as we all well know, there are all these auditory bases for learning language, how they can be diagnosed and then intervention can be set up. So that's the model that I'll be talking about today, is working together. In our world, technology is here to stay, but how has that impacted children growing up in this era? So not so much for auditory processing disorder, but the level of listening skills that children now today are developing are very different than the listening skills from 10 years ago. And of course, 20 years ago and 30 years ago. So much in society has changed that we've had to go along with. But in the end, my belief, and I know a lot of you agree with me, is that we're becoming a much more visually based society with the apps and the computer-based technologies. And even on NPR the other day, I heard a whole thing about creativity and how children's creativity has shifted from more the literature-based, language, words-based to more graphic-based and visual perception. So it's interesting how probably young children's brains are being rewired in a way that's different from children from the past. But when I go into kindergarten classes and first grade classes and I say to the teachers, what are the skills that these children are coming with that are different from skills of children 7, 10 years ago, the first thing they will say is they don't come prepared to listen. They don't know how to come into school and pay attention through audition. They don't use that word audition, but through listening. And we can see why that's happening. We know that there's not as much conversation, oral conversation going on in most households. You know, sitting down and discussing your day at dinner doesn't happen as often. Parents aren't reading as often to their children as they used to before bedtime. It still happens, but it doesn't happen the way it used to. There's not a whole lot of interaction between listening and speaking, that reciprocation that needs to happen. And all of those skills lead to good what? Something that we know second, third, fourth, fifth graders now are being putting into these groups because they have poor social skills, right? So we have a big influx in New York City. Every kid I know is going to social skills classes. And when I look at these social skills classes and I look at the skills that are being taught to these kids, I realize that the basis for every single one of those skills is listening and auditory skills. Because what they're expected to do, just as what they're expected to do in school, in mainstream school, and what they're supposed to do in interaction with their peers, is based on a reciprocation of listening and speaking. And if they have poor audition skills, poor listening skills, they're not going to develop that verbal interaction to the level that the other children are developing it. So we look at a couple of things going on. Kids with weakened auditory skills, going to schools where auditory skills are expected, and there's a certain level of expectation. So the child coming into school who's sitting in their seat, or supposedly sitting in their seat, and starts falling off their seat, right? We've seen this, and slipping onto the floor, or can't quite get themselves comfortable. The child who hears the lawnmower outside, if you're in the suburbs, and all of a sudden they're gone and they're lost because they're more involved with the lawnmower than with what the teacher's saying. The child that's saying, what, asking for constant clarification. The child that is very interested in anything visual, but the minute it becomes auditory, sort of tunes out and separates themselves. These may be kids with listening differences. They may be kids who have never been taught to listen, or they may be children who have auditory processing disorder. And that's what we sort of have to figure out. So let's think about a preschool class, 4-year-olds, and the teacher is teaching, and playing with the children. And one day the teacher says, tomorrow we're going to read the book Caps for Sale. And all the kids say, okay. And the next day, the teacher brings out the book, shows the picture, of the man with the hats and all the caps, and says, okay, we're going to read caps for sale. And our kid, my kid, says, where are the cats? Right? Everybody, okay, where are the cats? So now that happens often enough, and really what is that a problem with? That's not a problem with attention, right? That's a problem with discrimination. Puh for tuh, right, at the end of the word. So a couple of things are going to happen as a result of that. First of all, if it happens often enough, the teacher's going to start adding them up and thinking along some way. If that child also sort of is uncomfortable, and when things are very long conversations and there's lots of storytelling without pictures, and they become distracted, they're going to start adding that one up. And eventually, these things are going to add up, and what's the teacher going to do? What referral is the teacher going to make? To the speech pathologist? Where? The neurologists or the psychologists in the school, right? They're going to start going down the route of behavior. Behavior, because that's what they can see. And it's sort of understandable, except it's really a disservice, right? Because the child may be having difficulty listening, and if in about an hour from now you don't like what I'm saying, and you're tired, and you have to go to the bathroom, and there starts being noise in the background, and all of these things start happening, what would you do? What would you do? Tune out. She's a tuner-outer. What would you do? Tune out. Do I have anybody that would do something other than tune out? Because you're all very civilized, but what do you think a first grader might do? Right? Start moving around, start poking their neighbor, start talking, start playing with something in their desk, right? Start looking out the window. There's lots of behaviors that they would do, but it's not based on behavioral problems. It may be based on the way that they are having difficulty taking information in auditorily. And therefore, the behavior comes out. So we have to be looking at all of the pieces of what kids are presenting and really look deeper, like our kid with caps and cap, which is a discrimination problem. And besides being labeled incorrectly, possibly, what are the other things that can happen? That child may not learn the word cap. Now, on the EVT, the Expressive Vocabulary Test, there's a picture of a baseball cap, a red baseball cap, and the question is, what's another word for hat? Now, our little kid who didn't hear the difference between cap and cat never learned the word cap. They're going to get it wrong, but worse than that, they're going to grow up where it's going to take them a long time to learn that word cap, and it's going to affect not only their discrimination, but their comprehension and their storage of a lot of vocabulary, the same amount of vocabulary as the other kids. So we look at that one little area of discrimination, which is one little area of auditory processing, and we think about the consequences to comprehension. And that's what looking deeply at all the pieces of auditory processing does, because in the end, we don't care so much about each one of those little things. We want to know what are the effects of it. And then if we don't treat it at the level of where it occurs, if we're doing language therapy up here, but it's an auditory discrimination problem down here, not teaching the word cap, but actually teaching the difference between p and t at the end of the word, then we're not going to get to it. And that child is not going to have the scaffolding skills in order to move through the grades and attend in class. So the consequences of not finding these things and not treating them is really quite enormous for the child that has these disorders or difficulties. Did I make a good case for it? Okay, good. All right, so what are some of the at-risk behaviors? Poor listening skills, difficulty learning through audition, difficulty following verbal instructions, difficulty hearing in noise, says huh and what a lot, which if we look at pragmatics of language, what is that really when they say huh and what and ask for repetition all the time? My speech pathologist asking for clarification, right? So that's on the pragmatic hierarchy of skills of use of language. Misunderstands what's said, And so we can understand that if the kid's hearing cats for sale and there's no pictures of cats, they're really going to misunderstand what's going on and misunderstand what's said. And they may look like they have a short attention span because after a while, if you're listening and you don't get it, what are you going to do? Stop listening, right? Because you have nothing else you can do. There's no other escape for that. What are some of the classroom behaviors? Difficulty with phonics. If you're having difficulty with auditory discrimination, you may, or if you're having difficulty with auditory memory, you may have difficulty with blending sounds and remembering sounds by the time you get to the end of the word from where you started. So all of these have auditory bases. We know that reading and phonological skills all are based in audition first. In the way that phonics is taught in the classroom. The child may also have reading, spelling, and academic problems. They may have speech and language delays, poor auditory memory, give slow or delayed responses to verbal instructions. So it looks like they can't quite get the answer, but it may be the fact that they can't get it in the time allotted. They may have delayed processing skills, and they may exhibit behavioral problems. And the common indicators of, and you're going to see it written as APD or C, central, in parentheses, or central auditory processing disorders, but it's mostly APD now. When we test the kids and you start testing them for language, you're going to see a scatter of skills, or the neuropsychological skills are going to show scatter skills. You're very often going to see the verbal IQ lower than the performance IQ. Because for auditory processing disorder, most of the kids have very good cognition and high academic abilities, but something's getting in the way of that. It's not their cognitive abilities. History of chronic otitis media. So children that have chronic ear infections at young ages, why would that, after it's been cleared up, after they've had medication, had tubes, whatever they needed to get through that ear infection, why at age 7 and 8 might we see an auditory processing problem or auditory issues for that child? The problem is remediated. Why does that history, and I can tell you that 60 to 80% of the kids that come to me that are sent to me have a history of otitis, chronic otitis media. Why is that impacting comprehension and language later?
Is it the neural pathways not being developed?
The neural pathways, which are being developed in early, I'm repeating, that are being built, are being interrupted. And the information that's going in isn't clear for that 6 months, 8 months, year, however long they've had this battle of that information, and they're not getting the same access as another child who's building it and then holding and storing the information. Okay, we have kids that come in that have been adopted from a foreign country where they've been in an orphanage or in a situation where there's not a lot of stimulation in any language. How is that impacting, so that we see these kids come to this country, learn, they're very smart, they learn their language, their surface language really well, they learn, their speech is beautiful, but they start breaking down in 3rd or 4th grade. Their auditory skills can't scaffold and hold them up. Why? Why would that be historically a problem for them? Again, those auditory pathways, which are open from the minute we're born, and if we're born without a hearing loss, and many people say that they're being built in utero, that those pathways are being built and the child is sending information to the ear that hears, to the brain that eventually will understand, but the pathway is being built. And if that's interrupted or delayed, that child is going to have interruption or delay in the information and the accuracy with which they're getting it. So it sort of makes sense when you step back, but it's hard to think about it when all of a sudden they're in 4th grade and they seem to be doing great, and then all of a sudden things start falling apart. The children may have difficulty with multi-step directions, poor reading and spelling skills, and maybe poor music skills. Although I've seen the reverse true also, and kids with great music skills but poor auditory to language skills. So we have to then look, are those kids with auditory processing disorder? Those kids with auditory-based language processing? I made that term up, so don't look for that. Based language disorder. And like I said before, behaviorally, we're going to see a myriad of situations that that child may present based on poor audition or difficulty with the signal. So if we look at first grade, and I took this right off websites from suburbs around New York City, the things that we are expecting children to do in first grade, and I want you to tell me if any of these are based in auditory learning, okay? Phonics, learning, they have to know all the sounds for the graphemes of their consonants, their short vowels, their long vowels, eventually in second grade, their blends, their vowel combinations, and their morphological word endings, ing, ed, all, s's, plural, third person singular. All of those things are things that they are expected to know. Sound symbol, the initial, medial, and final. If I say the word cat, I like that word. Cat, what's the first sound you hear? What's the last sound you hear, right? I hear a k, that's a c, or a k. I hear a t, that's a t. In literature, the comprehension of literature now in first grade goes from not who, what, and where. They're expected to know that in kindergarten. Now they're already working on when, which is temporal, timing, and we need to know before, after, we need to know that time sequence. They need to know why, which is cause and effect. They need to know how, which is the series of steps to be able to get to the right answer. They have to be able to participate in discussions. They have to share information. They have to be able to retell a story, and they have to be able to memorize things. Any of these auditory skills? How many of them? All of them, okay? So if a child is having difficulty in their auditory skills, they're going to have more difficulty in being able to do the language expectation of these, of what's being expected of them in school. And any one of these can be held back by any one of the auditory processes. When we get to third grade, I call it the third grade wall, because we have most of our kids. Remember I said how smart they are, they're cognitively intact, and they are giving themselves lots and lots of strategies to be able to do the work. And then third grade hits, and what happens in third grade? What's different about third grade from second and first grade in kindergarten, right? The visual gets pulled back, the scaffolding gets pulled back, the children are not learning, they're not learning to read, they're reading to learn. Their expectations have risen, and the language starts going from concrete to abstract. They're expected to understand simple idioms and similes and metaphors. And all of that is happening in the classroom, and it's also happening with their peers. That's the language expectation. And so all of these kids that were doing so well when things were concrete and lots of visual, they didn't struggle as much. But then all of a sudden, that gets pulled back, and they start struggling. And this is what I see. Kids from third to sixth grade are the most kids that I get referred to me. Everything was going so well is what the parents said, and then all of a sudden they can't do it. What's going on? And one of the things that may be going on is this auditory processing disorder catching up with them. It's not that they didn't have it before, it's just that they were able to strategize, which they can't anymore. And then when we make our school transitions, what happens with auditory information? The children then have to understand inferencing, sarcasm, getting the joke. And if they don't, that's the difficulty in their peer relations. They can't quite keep up with the auditory input of what's happening. They're in groups, lots of kids are talking at the same time. They have to be able to shift their auditory attention and then take in that level of language. And that's really hard. Then when they go from middle school to high school, of course, there's more social pressure, and the language is coming faster and more furiously, and it's becoming more and more complex. And if they're not well scaffolded auditorily, they're going to break down. I would say that 50 to 60% of the kids that I end up, now remember I have a self-selected audience, or a caseload. The parents have somebody has said there's something going on with this child's auditory skills, so that's who I'm getting in my office. But at least 50% of these kids are diagnosed, or there is concern about anxiety disorder. Okay? And I think that that's really serious, because we think about these kids, they're smart, they can learn, they're able to do a lot of things, and then they feel like they're making mistakes all the time. A 13-year-old who was in my office the other day, after I told her she had an auditory processing disorder, diagnosed by the audiologist, and then she had listening issues diagnosed by me that were impacting. She said it takes her 5 hours to do her homework, where it takes 3 hours to 2 to 3 hours for everybody else. She's 13, and she never talks in class, ever. She talked beautifully to me. Her mother says she speaks beautifully at home. Why didn't she speak at school? Why? She's afraid she's going to say it wrong, and all the kids are going to laugh at her. She's going to repeat something that somebody already said. I mean, I know we're shaking our heads because we know this happens with our deaf and hard of hearing kids too. But remember, we're talking about kids that hear perfectly well, right? So they're not diagnosed with a hearing loss. They don't have any instrumentation or equipment that lets them know these kids. And so she said to me, I thought I was stupid, and I thought that there's no way I could go to high school at the school that I'm at. And now, I named my book The Sound of Hope for a reason, because now she felt like she had hope to now, get the intervention that's needed and move on from there and have a different image of herself. Not as a child that can't do it, but somebody that needs some help in some areas to be able to do it. So, look familiar? Right? We all feel very familiar with this. All right, so the reason I bring it up is because, all right, these kids all have normal, typical hearing. And how do we know that? Is that the evaluation for APD is always done with a hearing test first. And the reason for that is because we can't say that a child with a hearing loss has an auditory processing disorder if the child has a high frequency loss or a mild loss that may have not been identified and may be causing their problems that look like auditory processing. It may be actually the reverse, and we have to go down a different path. And they wouldn't continue with the rest of our testing when we find that hearing loss. But they get their hearing tested first, and then at our center, they get the Scan-C, which is that screening test for APD. All the kids get it, not just the 5 to 7-year-olds, because we don't do the CAP test until after the child has seen me. So we go from child hears fine, the child may have through the screening, may have some red flags, because we're testing listening and noise, we're testing dichotic listening, so we're testing certain areas, and those may be red flags. The child sees me, we see where their scores are falling on their language and their reading, and then we put that together and we decide whether the child needs to come back for the full CAP test for auditory processing. So we're really taking the steps rather than going auditory processing first and then what? Left with nothing. So it's a buildup. But the reason I usually show this diagram is because when we talk about discrimination, auditory discrimination, which is a big difficulty for kids with auditory processing disorder, I tell teachers, let's look at it, and let's look at 6,000, right, at 20 decibels. What do we see? We see and I'm going to say it this way, and right? Did you hear the differences between them? Probably not so well. I covered, and you're far away, and it's going through a mechanical device, right? But those kids that are having discrimination problems of those areas, let's look at why. Why? Because they share the same place on the audiogram. You share the same place on the audiogram, the acoustical information is very similar. So and maybe that child's having difficulty reading. Maybe that child has articulation disorder with high frequency sounds. Is it a motor problem, production problem, or maybe is it an auditory discrimination problem that's leading? So I think that we've been very lax as speech pathologists to look at auditory skills as the scaffolding towards speech and the scaffolding to language. But when kids are having difficulty in reading, and the teachers see this kind of, this, where the sounds are on the audiogram, it starts making sense as to why children may be having listening difficulties. And that child that's sitting in the back of the class to learn about S and Z is getting very different information than the kid sitting in the front desk, which now we have, everybody has preferential seating, right? The whole class is at the front of the room because everybody needs preferential, but these kids really need preferential seating. Okay, so we know that the kid's hearing is normal, right? That's one of the criteria to continue on with the auditory processing testing. Now we all know this, but I'm going to go through it anyway, because the second, so I would call hearing our first stage of information coming in, our auditory information. So the sound goes goes to the pinna or the auricle, which acts like a funnel. That's going to funnel the sounds into our ears. The sound then goes through the auditory meatus, the auditory canal, goes to the middle ear, where if the child has an conductive hearing loss caused by otitis media, then they're going to have difficulty getting all the sounds through. But let's say it's clear and the sounds go through. It then goes to the inner ear, into the cochlea, the shell-shaped organ, filled with thousands and thousands of cilia that are going to grab the sound, set up like a piano scale for the high-frequency hair cells are on the outer, going into the inner, which are the, we're doing it together, the inner, which are the low-frequency hair cells. The sounds go through and they get bundled in what? The eighth cranial nerve. Okay, so there we are. The child has received the auditory information. There's no problem in reception. Mechanically, the child hears. Good. Now what happens? So now the sound has to go from the ear to the brain. Okay? So we've got our right ear. Sounds come in. Oh, she needs you to move, I think. You want to come to this side of me for this? Is that okay? No, I need you, yeah. Is that okay? Okay, right. Okay, just for the picture. Okay, so the sound from the right ear is going to go to the left auditory cortex. The sound from the left ear is going to go to the right auditory cortex. So the sound has to then transverse and go up like this. All right. So now I want you to look at the numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 6. Sound comes in through the left ear, right, through the cochlea, and then makes this pathway up to the auditory cortex. Each one of those areas, the yellow spots there, are juncture points of processing of sound. So each one of those has the job of processing the sound. If there's delay or distortion at any one of those areas, the sound that goes up to the ear, goes up to the brain to be recognized as speech and language, right, is delayed or distorted. And therefore, what the child's receiving at their brain level is not what was said. And that is an auditory processing disorder. Okay? So the transfer of the information from the ear that hears to the brain that understands, that travel is where the signal gets delayed or distorted and causes an auditory processing disorder. Got it? Okay? And so we can't do testing of electrophysiological testing is being worked on to try to pinpoint each one of those juncture points and what's responsible for what, but we don't have that right now. So what we have are the CAP testing, the test that the audiologist does, that looks at the output from what the child hears, repeats back in some way to let us know if those areas are functioning. But that is auditory processing. Now the information has to go up to the auditory cortex that turns into language processing, central auditory, and it brings the information in, and now the child makes sense of the k, a, t. Those are the sounds. Oh, that's the word cat. And now language-wise, what does the child have to do with that word cat to be able to store it for later retrieval? They have to learn the semantic features of the word cat. But that's language, right? That's language. So they have to learn what? Pointy ears, furry skin, fluffy, soft, paws, claws, whiskers, wet nose, meow, purr, farm animal. You can just go on and on and on. And that's the information the child has to get to have that word cat now embedded in their brain for what I call the file cabinets for retrieval of that information when they want to use it or they want to understand it. But if it went in as and no t, now what does the child do? If the information, they don't hear cat as cat, and when somebody's saying cat, are they understanding it? They never had the opportunity to learn all those semantic features, language, about those sounds that make up that word cat. So does audition impact, or poor audition, impact language storage and retrieval and language building? Absolutely. But can we work at the comprehension level of, oh, look at this cat that has fur, and we teach all that if the child can't hear the word cat accurately and store the word cat accurately? They're still not going to get that information. So that's the difference between auditory processing and then language processing. Now, the child that doesn't pass the auditory processing test still may have auditory issues that are impacting their reception and their understanding of language, the comprehension of language, and that's where the speech pathologist has to be looking at underlying skills for language that may not be caught or in that child's auditory processing abilities. Are you all with me? Yeah? Good. Okay. So, auditory processing. So who's a candidate for the testing again? At least 7 years of age. There's the screening for 5 to 7. English as their primary language. Why would that? And so now we rule out this whole group of kids that spoke Spanish first, that spoke Japanese first, but why do we have to rule them out from auditory processing testing? Because the sounds of the language are totally different, and what they're going to give back to us is not going to be what they heard, and therefore we are going to be diagnosing all kids that speak another language with the auditory processing disorder, which of course is not true. So unfortunately, we can't do that. The speech pathologist can still do their testing and not use the label of auditory processing disorder, but can talk about auditory skills affecting language. There'll be symptoms. Kids with other disabilities, why wouldn't we go and try to diagnose kids with autism, with auditory processing disorder? There are audiologists that do. Lots and lots of audiologists that do. We don't. And why don't we? Because ASD is a condition that may have auditory processing as part of it, absolutely. But if we treat auditory processing for that child when they really need ABA therapy and regulation and all these other things, we're doing them a disservice. So knowing the diagnosis of auditory processing doesn't really help the child with ASD. And so maybe the speech pathologist would use more auditory strategies with that child or try to build them, but giving them the APD testing isn't going to help them in any way. We don't see children at our center with IQs below 80, and that's because they'd have a very hard time taking the test. And again, we don't want to diagnose kids with other disabilities that are more prevalent for them and a more appropriate diagnosis with APD. And those within normal hearing limits, and kids with attentional issues, which it's hard to rule them in and out. But the important thing to know about auditory processing disorder is that 60% of auditory processing disorders coexist with some other condition, whether it's sensory integration, whether it's ADD, ADHD, they're going to coexist. And so trying to pick it out and know the differences. So at the end of this afternoon, hopefully you'll know the differences and you'll be able to start pulling apart what is what with these kids. Okay, so there is our way we test. How am I doing with time? Great. Okay. Yes? Oh, very good question. Her question is, are we testing kids with attentional issues? Yes, we are. Yes, we are. Kids that are on medication we ask them to be on their medication for the testing. Because if they already have an attentional, and we're trying to separate out, because kids with attentional disorders, right, ADD, ADHD, that get medication, and their medication is working for them, they shouldn't have attentional problems anymore. But what about the kid that still is saying, huh? What did you say? And is that, well, something else is going on. So that will be a coexisting condition. Kids that aren't on it, the audiologist has a test available to them called the Continuous Performance Test, right? They all hate it. They hate it because there are like 500, 700 stimuli, and the child sits with a button, and they hear word after word after word after word, 700 words, and every time they hear the word dog, they have to press the button. Well, kids that have attentional disorder are not going to be they're going to be pressing the button all the time. They're not going to be pressing it. They're going to be doing other things, ripping the inserts out. So that gives us an idea that there are other things. We can't diagnose attentional, but we can say it looks like there are some attentional issues. And in my evaluation, I'm looking at attention all the time because what I'm going to be talking about, the first hour of my 2.5-hour evaluation is completely auditory, no pictures, no writing. So we get to see what the child does during that time. But we do evaluate them and we do diagnose them. Yes?
Are you testing children with learning disabilities?
Are we testing children with learning disabilities? Absolutely, yes. Because auditory processing disorder is not a learning disability, right? But it affects the way they learn.
But did you have not have a disability?
Say that again?
If a child has a known disability,
They can, a known disability with any kind of learning disorder, they can still be tested for auditory processing. And if they're showing the signs of what I'm talking about today, they should be tested. Because how is that affecting their learning? Right. Okay? So it really is a differential diagnosis. We're really knowing all these things either can coexist or the child is being diagnosed with something that may not be appropriate. I've had many, many children that have come in that have been put on medication, and in the end, they did not have attentional disorders. They had auditory processing disorder, and that's a very sad thing to learn. So why not do the differential diagnosis up front rather than after the kid's already medicated and having the difficulties of medication? Okay, so this is my handy-dandy chart that I put together that looks at the skills that we look at when we're testing the child, both from the audiological perspective and the speech and language perspective. And so the way that it happens, we look at auditory attention. Auditory attention is our basis. If a child can sit and listen and attend through listening, then they're going to have a problem with everything else, right? That's our basis, and that's why, you know, when you come back at some point for my therapy day of therapy to treat auditory processing disorder, we spend a lot of time on whole body listening and how to teach the child whole body listening, which is an answer to, or at least an accommodation for, auditory attention. So we're looking at that. Both the audiologist and myself are looking at that. That is qualitative, not quantitative, right? That's we're looking at the way they take the tests. The next row is the audiological testing. So the audiologist is testing auditory figure ground, listening and noise. The way that they do that is the end result is +8. So the child is listening to words through headphones, and they have to repeat back the words, and the noise level, which is multi-speaker babble, is brought up to +8, meaning the signal, the voice, is 8 decibels louder than the background noise. They also tested 0 because kids functioning in the classroom can perform at 0, but we're looking at the +8 condition. So can the child separate out signal from noise over time for that test? The second test, which is auditory phoning discrimination, is something I end up doing because the audiologists feel I have a better test than they do for that. So I end up doing that testing. Suprasegmentals, temporal. So this is a very interesting test. This is where the sounds the child hear are 3 sounds, and they sound like this: beep, beep, beep. And the child has to say high, high, low, right? Well, that's a problem because those sounds are being interpreted on the right brain. And now we're asking the child to switch it over and label it on the left brain, from the left brain with the label. So our audiologist asked the child to hum it, because then you're staying in the sound rather than in the label. They'll go, and that if they can't do it with labeling, we look at it that way. But what is that telling us? That's telling us the highs and lows. And if we look at what that affects prosody and intonation. Right? So we've got a lot of things, I think, that language and speech, when I'm talking to you, many of the things that I'm saying, you're listening to the rhythm of my voice. You're getting a lot of information just from my intonation, which children that have this difficulty do not. So I have a kid who has this pretty severely, who speaks in a monotone. His is so severe that he can't monitor his own speech, and everything sounds monotone because that's the way he hears it. Well, what does he have problems with? What do you think he has problems with? Definitely sarcasm, inferencing. He can't hear the difference between, without the words, by saying a WH question or a yes-no question, because is it raining goes up, and what's your name goes down. Those simple cues are very important in our daily communication for understanding. The big problem also here is syllable stress. So if you don't have difficulty with this, you don't hear the sound, the stress of the sentence or the stress of the syllable. So if I teach you the word convict, right? What is a convict? And then I say the word convict, that child's not going to know that those are two words. So in the end, what does it do? It affects comprehension and storage of information to build their lexicon of information, vocabulary information. So this is something that you can only get at if the child's actually having a problem in the pathways from this test. We're not going to learn that any other way. And a speech pathologist can work on syllabification, but if they're not doing it in the right way from the auditory, the child's not going to make gains. The next one is auditory closure. They hear a sentence, part of it is, or a word, part of it is interfered with through interference, and the child has to close the set. They have to say what they heard. Auditory figure ground and auditory closure sort of go hand in hand, those two, and they are the only two, I know I'm going to say something sort of controversial, that require an FM trainer in the classroom. Deaf and hard of hearing children, everybody should have a FM, no doubt. But the go-to remediation for auditory processing disorder is FM. What we're going to see is making the other things louder doesn't do one bit of good, unless they're having some attentional issues and auditory figure ground issues. But if they have an auditory memory problem, or they have a binaural integration and separation problem, making the signal louder doesn't help them at all. So it's actually a very bad referral or strategy to use. And if a child is using an FM, because they have auditory figure ground problems, if on their IEP they aren't also getting training of listening in noise, you're really not doing that child any good, because they are listening in noise in the classroom with enhanced sound, and that's great for academics, but then they go to gym, or they go to lunch, or they go to the mall, and they can't hear a noise. So the speech pathologist here's my question to you. Should the teacher of the deaf be seeing kids with auditory processing disorder? What do you think? I'm only halfway done. What do you think? Absolutely. Absolutely. Who better? I got to tell you that when I give my lecture to speech pathologists, a quarter of them get it. When I give my lecture to teachers of the deaf, speech pathologists that work with deaf and hard of hearing kids, and audiologists, 90% get it. Because most people have no idea how audition affects language and learning. So would I vote for a really good teacher of the deaf that does pull out, preview, and review, and works through the auditory channel with those kids, like they do with deaf and hard of hearing kids, but on the things that we're going to delineate for these kids? I'd choose that person over the resource room teacher any day. So, now you may not want to do it. That's a whole other issue, but do I think you're the right people to do it? Yes, because I have nobody else to help me. Most speech pathologists don't look at this and say, what are you talking about? And they want to do their sequencing cards, and they want to do comprehension. And that's what they want to do. They don't want to look at these underlying skills. I'm going to take one question, and then I'm going to move on. Did you have some?
Yeah, you might address this, so if you are.
Okay, so why don't you wait and hold it, write it, okay?
Well, I'm having a hard time getting past it in relation to this. I'm confused about how we can conclude anything. I mean, like, how does attention not play into these things?
Attention does play into it, but we have to be looking at what, well, I'm going to talk about that in a little while, so wait for that, okay? The last one from the audiologist, there's also gap detection that I don't have up here, but binaural integration and separation is really very interesting to me. And it wasn't until I started working with the audiologist closely to really understand this. Are the two ears functioning at the same time in the same way. So that we could have a right ear that's processing information really well and easily and gets a 90% on this test, and we can have a left ear that's only getting 50%. And what happens is then the message that's coming to be centrally processed is not getting there in the same amount of time or in the same way, which is causing a lot of, huh? What did you say? I didn't get that. Or not holding on to things from day to day to day. So I find that this is a really important area, and the fix for it is really simple. So, and Chris with a K, English, has done a lot of research on this, and you can look up, and I'm just going to quickly say what the remediation would be for it. But so we do separation. No, let me do integration first. Binaural integration, the child hears, it's dichotic listening, 2 words in this ear, 2 words in this ear, or 2 digits, and they have to say what all 4 of them are. So they have to integrate it all and say the 4 words with 4 digits. Separation is 2 words, what did you hear in your right ear? So we're going to do only right ear, and then later, 2 words, what did you hear in your left ear? And they take the percentages, and then they and then they talk about right ear or left ear advantage. The norms, of course, show that there is a right ear advantage, and that's a typical normal, so that the norms take that into account. Yes? Integration? Yes, same time. But I can do it. Right? 4 different words. Yeah, and it's a very interesting test to take, and you think you're not going to be able to do it, and you can do it. And then I have some of my therapists that can't do it. I say, you need some therapy. But what do? We treat it like the lazy eye, right? So what do you do with the lazy eye? You patch the good eye, and you make the weaker eye work harder. So here what you do is you put noise in the room, music, whatever, and you have a CD of a story. My 4th graders, girls, I use Black Beauty, and I've listened to it already. I've listened to 5 minutes of it, and I have my comprehension questions ready. I put an earbud into their weaker ear while their other ear is taken up with this background noise. They listen to that 5 minutes of Black Beauty, they take it out, I ask them comprehension questions. What I'm doing is strengthening the pathway. And then I have them measured by the audiologist every so often to see where we are, because we don't want to build up that ear so high and leave the other ear. We want to keep them balanced. But the therapy works. And you can do it in schools if you can have an audiologist that the child is seeing. You can do it in schools. You can do it if you do it very sensitively, like you do 2 minutes each time you see the child. You could start getting that ear acclimated. You may not correct the problem. But remember, you only do that if on the APD evaluation from the audiologist, it says that the child has a severe advantage one ear and needs building up in the other ear. But that's the only way I've come across of helping work that. And we've done a lot of good work with that at our center with the kids. And we have a listening room. We have a whole place where we can do that kind of listening therapy. Oh, questions? Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Okay, so the weak side is also the weak side with his hearing, impairment.
No, but we can't talk about hearing impairment. These kids hear absolutely perfectly.
But if they have, so you're saying there's no child with auditory processing that has a hearing loss?
We are not testing any child with a hearing loss for auditory processing. So forget that they're not hearing well in that ear. They're hearing perfectly well. I know, it's hard. It's hard to start separating all of it out. Okay, so then that's audiology, and now we start looking at my testing. I use, and so, yes?
Sorry, one quick question about the
Bye.
strength of one ear. You were talking about FMs before and how FMs sometimes are not effective. I work with FM systems, and sometimes I do put on an FM, an iSense, or an ear level receiver. In the event that you have one ear that's stronger than the other, would you recommend putting an ear level receiver on the core ear to strengthen that?
You know, I was just thinking about that, but I wouldn't, I would have to talk to my audiologist about that. I couldn't make that decision, and I'm going to bring that question back to her, because I was just thinking about it at this point, but we've never done that.
Okay, I mean,
Okay, are you doing that?
Audiologist,
Yes?
I don't like to necessarily put that FM on that roofer ear depending on their age. Now, if they're completely old and past their natural age, I would put it on the weaker ear to help strengthen that side. Now, where in high school we're trying to take notes, I care more that they're getting the information and they never get all the processing. So I would put
Right.
it on the stronger ear to really please
Right.
Little kids, I prefer sound because I can't pick the ear, I don't want to mess with ear neurology.
Yeah, right. So you really have to be very careful, because it is neurological that we're dealing with. So I would rather do the training rather than do it through FM. All right, so the way that I'm testing, the first hour of my testing is all auditory. I use the TAPS 3. I use the whole TAPS 3. TAPS 3 looks at word discrimination. It's the same different test. It's like a Wetman. So card, it's done covered. Card, cart, the child has to say if it's same or different. Miss, mess, child has to say it's different. And what we're looking for is patterns of problems. Is it final sound? Is it short vowels? Now, if it's short vowels and the child's 5, I'm not going to look at that. If the child's 6 and above, they should have discrimination of their short vowels. And so is that going to impair and affect their phonological skills? Yes. So again, these things are going to affect their way up. So so that would be phoneme discrimination, would be through that word discrimination test on the TAPS 3. The TAPS looks at auditory memory, auditory sequential memory, phonological segmentation, phonological blending, and then the top of this chart are really the language things that a child has to do in school with their auditory skills. They have to be able to auditory comprehension, listen to a story and be able to answer questions. They have to be able to follow oral directions, step directions. They have to be able to listen to a story, identify the main idea. These are the language things they have to do, but we're going to test for them also from a listening language perspective. The second hour of the test, I then bring in pictures. So I'm looking, when we're looking at attention, what was the child like qualitatively during that first hour when everything was taken away except for audition, which we think they have a problem with, and is their behavior the same the second hour when all of a sudden they have pictures? And what we see a lot of are kids that can hold it together during the first hour and having more difficulty the minute I bring out the pictures, or I have them following directions with pencil and paper. They're sitting up, they're doing it, and everything's fine. So we start looking at what are their listening behaviors versus when they're getting listening and looking and visual and tactile kinesthetic feedback. So we're just making observations about these things, and then if the child can't hold it together at all on the chair during auditory, what else could they be telling me? They're falling off the chair, they're drumming on their face, they're drumming on the table, they're swimming on the table. I get kids that they're telling me, I need more input. I'm not getting enough input. And that's somebody that I'm going to refer to an occupational therapist for sensory integration evaluation. And we see lots of kids with auditory processing disorder that also have SI. because we're looking at the sensory system. We have lots of kids with auditory processing disorder that also have visual processing disorder and end up going to a vision therapist, which we don't test for, but the parents from the neuropsych very often end up going that route. So again, 60% of auditory processing disorders do coexist with other things. Auditory memory, how much can the child hold into memory, both for immediate retrieval and delayed retrieval? So another test that we give is the APAT. The APAT has the only test I know, speech and language test I know, that has, you read a paragraph to the child, it's an age-appropriate paragraph. The child has to tell you back everything they remember in order from that, and you score it accordingly. Then you do something else, and you've told the child you're going to tell me the story twice. You do something else, which I usually do following directions on the APAT, and then I come back and say, remember that story I told you before? What, can you tell me that story? So we know that, we all know the kid, that you could read the story, ask the questions, they do well. 5 minutes later, you ask them the questions, they can't do anything. But what about the kid who can't do it immediately, but 5 minutes later can give you the whole story? What are they telling us? What are they saying my problem is? Delayed auditory processing. They take longer to get that information and to hold on to it, but once they do, so I might say to that teacher of that class, don't call on this kid first. Give this kid processing time. You know, while we're doing the therapy for that, give this kid time, because they're not going to answer it right away, but they do have the information and they are going to be able to do it. So it gives us a lot of information like that. Auditory sequential memory, how much can the child hold in order? So that would be step directions. We have lots of kids. I had a 12-year-old the other day that came in, and when I said, can you tell me the months of the year? So it wasn't from the self where it was time, just tell me the months of the year. January, March, June, May, 12 years old. His mother said he could never learn the words to Happy Birthday, couldn't learn the words to poems, couldn't. Auditory sequential memory, can't hold on to it in order. So we start seeing, and what is that going to affect academically? What do you need step by step for math, right? So I have lots of kids that come in and say to me, oh, you know, I can answer any math question, and they can. They're brilliant. And you ask them a question, they can figure it out in their head, but they can't do it in class because what are they expected to do? Show your work. And if you have to show your work step by step by step, and they can't hold on to the steps that they were taught, they're not going to do well in math, even though they can do math. So we heard that. So you know, each one of these difficulties starts playing out academically. You could start seeing the chain of what may happen to that child academically. Phonological segmentation. So I'll do the little test with you. I'll do parts of it. I'll say a word, you say it after me, then I'm going to ask you to leave part of it out. Cupcake, without the cup. Last, without the l. Went, without the n. Okay, so those are different parts of the test, but that's what we're expecting the child to do. So they have to know their sounds, they have to be able to almost see their sounds and move them around. That's segmentation. Based in auditory, yes. Phonological blending. Phonological blending has a lot to do with blending, but it also has to do with auditory memory, okay? Because I say the word ah. You had to remember each one of those sounds, blend them together, and come up with the word. What about the word s, k, e, n? Right. And the kids that, I'll do the word, the one that they always, kids that have difficulties always have difficulties with is this one. L, p. They'll say pulp, or they'll say help. Right? What are they doing? They're not holding on to those sounds in order. And so when they learn to read, when they go and they find a word they don't know, and they try to sound it out, those are the kids that by the time they get to the end, they have no idea what those first couple of sounds were. So they skip over the word, right? And so we were looking at phonological blending and auditory skills. And then up here, of course, we're following directions, pen and paper. There's a grid, and they have to fill it out on the APAT. Answering oral questions, that's auditory comprehension. And we have 2 subtests, auditory comprehension, which is concrete information from the paragraph, and then inferencing similes and metaphors, which is called auditory reasoning. So the whole test is great, and what you get is a grid, and you start putting the grid, and after a while you start seeing the patterns. The kids that can't do the sounds that are separated and don't have any context, but can do all the contextual work, more auditory processing. Kids that can do all the pieces and the sounds and all of that, they can't do the comprehension and the reasoning. And we start looking at, is it an auditory based or is it a language based? And we can start looking at the patterns that the child's presenting to us. So that you have here, what I have in your handout are the tests that I give, okay, and the parts, the subtests that I give for ages 5 and up. For kids, if I want to go further, let's say there's an area that I'm not really happy about, I have other tests I could give as a speech pathologist. Now, the SELF is an interesting test. The SELF test is a language processing test. Lots of kids will pass that and still have an auditory processing problem, but if we go back and look at their SELF, speech pathologists, we will see 3 subtests that they usually won't do well at if they have auditory difficulty. We'll be recalling sentences, which is really auditory memory, but that's not the way it's scored for the SELF. It's scored from language. We have understanding paragraphs and following concepts and directions, which also has visual, so it's really not a completely auditory. But kids will do poorly in that. We have the CASTLE, not the castles, the CASTLE, which gives more higher functioning language. We have the CTOP that does more work into the phonological, and the listening comprehension test. So these would be further probes, but I get enough information from the TAPS, the APAT, the EVT, PPVT, and the test of narrative language, because in the end, can the child tell a story? Can they tell a cohesive story? Because we know that verbal expression also relies on that audition and learning of the information and your syntactical and semantic information in order to be able to use your expressive language. So that would be a complete battery along with the CAP test from the audiologist. All right. We also give, for under 5s, I really don't test under 4s for auditory processing. I think that very often parents will ask me to test them. I will give them the SELF preschool because I'm a speech pathologist, and I'll look at some informal measures, but by no means do I say that that child has an auditory processing disorder or really has auditory difficulties. I might give a different way for the speech pathologist to work with them, that I would alter that, but I wouldn't use any of those. We give out a checklist. Okay. We give out a checklist at our center for the parent and the classroom teacher. I love this checklist. It's called the Fisher's Auditory Problems Checklist. You can get it online. You can just Google it. And I like to get that information before I test the child, because I want to know, that will tell us very clearly the child's daydreaming. It will be all these attentional things and none of the auditory things. It will be all the auditory things and you start looking at the pattern of what the parent sees, what the teacher sees, and then we use that as while we're looking at the child. I don't think it colors what I do. I think it adds information. We also request any reports that have been done on that child. So I read the neuropsychs. We do all of that background work. And of course, we're looking at the child's behavior during the evaluation. So, therapy. I get 10 minutes to talk about therapy. All right. So, what's the matter?
You get 15.
No, well, not really. We have to say. Let's do this. So, let's look at when we're doing sessions with these kids. What do we have to think about? We have to think about that auditory information is bottom-up information. It has to be built piece by piece by piece from the lowest to the highest in small increments of success. I'm going to say that again. Auditory skills have to be built from the bottom up, step by step by step, because every step depends on the step below it, to increase that child's ability in each auditory skill and where the child meets success. So the steps have to be small, incremental, and the child has to be feeling successful. That's my belief. That's what I think over these 40 years has been successful for me. But language therapy is top down. And what does that mean? It's metacognitive. Remember all those semantic features I gave you before, about the cat with the pointy ears? All of that's metacognitive, and that's information. And so really, when we're working with these kids, we have to be building their listening skills and at the same time giving them this metacognitive information from the top down so that it ends up in language. Because building skills, and the reason I do not use any of the computerized programs, Fast Forward, Aerobics, blah, 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 you'll hear tons of them, they haven't been known to, the efficacy of them has not been proven, number one. Number two, I believe that the auditory intervention is best one-on-one with a person because it has to be reciprocal and it has to have conversation going on. And I believe that the child has to be steeped in language because in the end, that's what we're left with is we have to perform in language. And so building skills has to happen, but the child has to see how it integrates into language. So that's what I call an integrated lesson plan. And I'm going to show you that here. So this is basically when I devise my treatment plan for the child, I'm going to go back to that schematic and I'm going to locate on that schematic the one that looks like the trapezoid, right? The trapezoid with the different colors. I'm going to see where the weakened skills are. And my therapists go and they put a little check mark. This is where I'm going to start. And from the report, they know at what level to start at, right? We're going to put all those skills together into a plan of therapy, right? Because I'm not going to say, today I'm going to work on auditory discrimination, and next week I'm going to work on auditory memory, and the week after that I'm going to work on auditory sequential memory. The child's going to get better maybe at certain skills, but it's going to be meaningless to them when they walk into the classroom. So we have to build a way for them to be able to put it all together. On that trapezoid, if they had everything disordered, or 90% of those areas disordered, is that auditory processing disorder? It's global. And global is not auditory processing disorder. So that's one of the things that lets us know that if the child can't do any of the tests according to norms, it's not really an auditory processing disorder. The child has much more, and I've seen many kids come in like that, and the parents desperately want it to be auditory processing disorder. But they actually have a far larger problem because they're not able to be successful at any one of those skills. So when I'm planning therapy, the way I'm thinking about it is schematically like this. So this child over here, this child had difficulty auditory closure, auditory memory, listening and noise, and discrimination, right? Those were the skills. So now I have to think about at what level, each one of those, where did they start to break down? And I have to devise some therapy to work on each one of those skills at the level where they are. But if I don't put it into language, they're just hanging out there. So let's say I decide that my center circle is chicken soup with rice. That's my language. That's where I'm going to pull my language lesson from. So maybe I've done these spot skills now. I've worked on auditory closure. I pulled off, there's a great materials-wise, the Central Auditory Processing Kit by Marianne Moelkmer, Moelkmer, from Linguasystems, is a three books and covers every single one of the areas I showed you up there on my trapezoid. But if you do it as a program, all you're doing is building skills. But if you pull the information to do your spot skills, it's great material. Everybody got that? What I'm saying, what I'm recommending for? Not to take it and say, okay, I know how to do auditory processing therapy. I'm going to do a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of this. Use the materials, but think about how are you going to put it into language? How are you going to? So I would use it for my spot skills and move the child up. But now I'm going to do chicken soup with rice. Do most of you know this book? Right? Okay. I'm going to read you the first page. In January, it's so nice, while slipping on the sliding ice, to sip hot chicken soup with rice. sipping once, sipping twice, sipping chicken soup with rice. And it goes on to February, March, April, May. So knowing what you know about the auditory skills, what could you do for this to build auditory memory? You want me to give you all the answers, don't you? You're tired and you just want me to give you the answers. Okay, so there's a number of things we could do. Let's say we want to build auditory memory for sentences, right? That might be because when in the auditory memory test for TAPS, it's phonemes, words, sentences, content information. We want to see where they break down. So let's say this child can do the words apple, bed, desk. Apple, bed, desk. They can do it. But when you put it into context, they can't do it. They fall, the middle of the sentence falls out, and that's the middle is where the details are. Or they always miss the beginning of the sentence, or we're looking for patterns, or always the end of the sentence. And it's always when it's more than 5 words, or it's always when it's more than 3 words. So we know where we're starting with what they can hold in memory and repeat back. So can I do exact listening or tracking? I don't know what you guys call it, but I can do, remember, you're the kids, in January, it's so nice. While slipping on the sliding ice. To sip hot chicken soup with rice. Okay, so if you had made a mistake, right? Good teachers of the deaf, and you said while nipping on the sliding ice instead of slipping. Right? Well, you're going to note that because nipping and slipping, I have to go back and do some auditory to scrim work, but in the real time, I have to say, oh, listen again, while slipping, right? I have to use acoustic highlighting to get them to take out that word and know that that word was not the word they said, but now they can hear that word. And now, can I ask a comprehension question? Now, I've fulfilled some auditory memory work just now, right? But is that can I do auditory comprehension just from that? And the reason is no, is because they heard it in pieces. That's not fair. So now I would go, in January, it's so nice while slipping on the sliding ice to sip hot chicken soup with rice. What was he doing on the ice? Okay, so now I've done the auditory memory. Now I've read it again, I've noted if there were discrimination errors, if they made an error because of the word, I'm going to use acoustic highlighting to make sure they got every single word. If I don't think they know slipping and sipping, I'm going to go over those words before I ever read this book to make sure they have the vocabulary. And now I can ask a question. What was he doing on the ice? And they'll say slipping, and now I show them the picture. Now, I did not read the book to him this way. Why not? Because now they're making up their own story. And they're only going to know what's on that picture if they have poor listening skills. But if I read it this way and do all of it this way and use the picture as reinforcement, now I've done an auditory lesson versus a visual auditory lesson. Right? So what could I build into this book? Could I do phonological blending from this story? Right. I could use the word s, l, e, p, e, ng. I wouldn't use that word, but I could use that word, right? Because the ng is not a good thing. But could I pull out words from here and do, if the child had phonological blending problems? Could I do, so could I use this book for all of those skills? Could I do it in noise? Could I do, and then, but read the story for comprehension in the end? Yes, and it works. It works. It takes planning. It takes knowing where the child's difficulty areas are, but it works every time. Because the child walks out holding on to language, holding on to information, learning something about this book, but also building each of their skills. Because the next book I read is going to have a different topic and different things that I'm going to do with it, and come back and we'll do therapy for a whole day. But there's so many things I can do to work on every single one of those skills based on what that child's deficit areas were and where they broke down. All right? I've included in here just some of the auditory strategies to use. You all know these because we do them with the deaf and hard of hearing kids. I use a lot of visualization and drawing. I do a lot of writing to dictation for auditory memory. Chunking, tapping out, all of that is in your handout. My equation for successful therapy or intervention is consistency plus fun over time equals progress. You have to be consistent in the therapy that you're doing. You can't work on an auditory skill here, an auditory next week another one, and this one and that one. It has to be fun, we all know that, and you have to do it over time. Auditory skills aren't built quickly, and that's the way to get progress. Accommodations for school, very similar to the ones for, based on the evaluation, similar for kids with hearing loss. Home strategies, very similar. I've written a book called The Sound of Hope. Like Rosie O'Donnell or not, she wrote the introduction to it because I worked with her son Blake, who had auditory processing disorder. We were successful and she forced me to write the book. It's mostly for kids, the exercises at the end are for kids under the age of 7, so it's a way to play with kids and work with kids through auditory skills, reading, rhyming, all of that. But before diagnosis, I'm now working on the manual for 7s and up. It's a little harder, and this was really hard. And I have apps for the iPad that are listening language apps distributed to Pocket SLP. Mine are Category Carousel, which is categorization of language. It's a lot of fun. I also have One Step, Two Step, which is a 24 boards of following step directions and coloring with your finger. The kids love it. Tell Me a Story, which is story narration using puppets and using familiar stories. And then there are 2 that aren't up here, Listening Adventures, Little Red Riding Hood, and Billy Goat's Gruff, which are auditory games based on listening to the story, and that are all in the app. And that's it. I'll take questions, yeah. What? Frequency. Therapy, intervention. So at our center, we see the kids twice a week for an hour. I know that's not possible. Now those kids may be getting language therapy at school, but they come after school for us. Some kids, the older kids, come once a week. It's an hour, and it's an hour of consistent therapy with things they can do at home. Do they always do them at home? No. With the kids, I've done a lot of pre and post testing. I haven't published it yet, but kids that came and had that full evaluation with auditory processing, and of course, each kid is different for which skills they had difficulty with. And 2 years later, the kids usually stay with us for 1 year to 2 years. If they have to stay with us more than 2 years, then we're not doing something right. But I will test them at the end of 1 year or 2 years. Now they're older and the standardization is different, but no sooner than 1 year, usually 2 years. And the success rate has been amazing, even with 1 time a week therapy, targeted therapy. But it's an hour. Could it be done in 2 half-hour sessions? Yes. But it has to really be rigorous. It's not, playing, it's really building those skills and putting them into language, and that the fun has to be in the session. And anybody that's in the New York area, I have my card here, and if you'd like to come and observe some therapy, our kids come after 3 o'clock for auditory processing. We have one-way mirrors, and we have rooms, observation rooms, and we have lots of people that observe, and that's always welcome. Yeah.
Can any of these therapies be used with children who have auditory deprivation as a result of identified hearing loss?
I think, did everybody hear that question? Repeat the question, okay? She was busy. Her auditory attention wasn't with me.
Could any of the therapies be used with children who have auditory deprivation caused by late identified hearing loss?
Absolutely. And I just actually submitted a paper to A.G. Bell for next to talk about auditory processing issues in hearing impaired children. And how are these skills, what are the crossover skills, and what would be the therapies that would benefit both. So hopefully they'll accept it, and I'll be talking about it, but it's something really interests me. And because I have the population at school, so lots and lots of parents of our hearing impaired kids, older hearing impaired kids, want to come in for the auditory processing tests. Of course, we can't do that, but I give them my evaluation because I find that we're working with these kids when they're young, and we're working with them with auditory oral, auditory verbal, for mainstreaming in school, and some of them aren't doing well. So are they having more difficulty with processing? Yes. Can the therapy stay the same all the way through? No. So I think by looking at it through this lens, we may get a better way of working with those kids and working more on the processing of the sound, because we know now that the input is good. They're getting good reception through cochlear implants or hearing aids. So what's going on? So do we have to work on different skills and more specific processing skills? Yes, I believe that to be true. Yes.
Yeah, as follow-up.
Yes.
Same question, except, because many of these are so similar to or the same as what we do with the hearing loss, except the listening and noise piece. And I was wondering if that's, last I had read, for people with hearing loss, there was no evidence showing that could actually be improved, since the listening and noise might be affected by something other, obviously, the
Right.
processing. Has anything changed in terms of that? Is that something that now you would recommend even for people with a hearing loss, or no?
At our center, we do, for kids that are having difficulty, we do use the same strategy I use for these kids. We have a listening room that's acoustically appropriate, and we have on the screen, we have a movie of the playground, and then the playground noises, and then we train the child. So it's visual and auditory distraction, and we do listening and noise therapy. So we do it not using their FM, but using their hearing aids or cochlear implants. So we do that, and we use the same. Then we also, the strategy in the therapy room, I have, what kind of music, what kind of decibel level, and we increase it. And we see the kids, for the most part, getting more sensitive towards it and being able to separate it. But let's say if the cochlear implant isn't working to do that separation, it's not. With the hearing, with the listening and noise, with the auditory processing kids, definitely we make an impact. Definitely.
So you're not necessarily.
I'm so sorry.
That's it.
They have to set up for their panel. I'm so sorry. But
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.